Let's start then. Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you around, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak at Hartford Seminary about this African journey that took us to Tanzania, I think, last winter. Why am I interested in Africa, in sub-Saharan Muslim Africa? Because usually nobody speaks about it, as if it was not part of the Muslim world. And as this semester I'm teaching Islamic history first part, I have, of course, no time during the course to speak about Islamic Africa. So I thought, okay, let's have a public lecture about it, and hopefully it will complement a little bit the course of Islamic history. And so we went to Tanzania, my wife and I, last winter, and the main aim of that trip was to go to a city called Kilwa. Why Kilwa? Because a Moroccan traveler, very famous Moroccan traveler of the beginning of the 14th century, had been there among the many other places to which he traveled. Usually, when you read the Arabian Nights, you hear about Sinbad the sailor, and the travels of Sinbad take you to the southeast of Asia, mostly by sea. And as a sailor, Sinbad, we are told, faced a few times this kind of problems when his ship sunk or was destroyed by storms or other things. It is very interesting to read those type of adventures by Sinbad and other Muslim traders who were going to Southeast Asia by sea, because it's not just a tale. It happened. Muslims were indeed going to that region of the world, and sometimes they were indeed losing all their goods as well as their ship. One of the most famous shipwrecks of the Islamic classical period is what is called the Belitung shipwreck. It's a sailboat that was coming back from China and that sunk in this little place northern of Indonesia there. The wreck was found during the 20th century. It was found full of treasures, mostly Tang Chinaware, but also some gold artifacts. And that shipwreck was studied thoroughly and was rebuilt. And this copy of it is now preserved in the Maritime Museum of Singapore. And so it shows you that indeed Muslims were traveling not just the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, but going as far as Indonesia and then the coast of China, but they were also traveling down the east coast of Africa. And that's what Ibn Battuta did. Ibn Battuta traveled by sea as he traveled by land. Compared to him, it can be said that Marco Polo didn't go that far, because Ibn Battuta was born in Tangiers, Morocco. He went to China at some point. He traveled in India. He traveled in southern Russia, Ukraine. He traveled in Iran. And he traveled in Africa, this part of sub-Saharan Western Africa, and then by sea he traveled down to Kilwa. And that's why I wanted to follow him, because he's probably the most famous Muslim traveler of the classical period. He's still remembered as such. If you go to Dubai, don't forget to look not just at the Burj Khalifa, but also go to the Ibn Battuta shopping mall. Just have to take the metro to the Ibn Battuta station. And that mall is conceived as a world as Ibn Battuta knew it. The different parts of the mall have been built according to the architecture of the regions of the world that Ibn Battuta traveled to, except one, Africa. And we have the same problem with this book written by the translator of the travelogue of Ibn Battuta, Tim Smith, who tried to follow the steps of Ibn Battuta everywhere he went. The book is very interesting, but Smith didn't make it to Eastern Africa. So somehow I had to complement this book by going there myself and see what had happened there. And Ibn Battuta traveled to Eastern Africa by sea. And before we go to Kilwa itself, it's important to pay attention to what it meant to travel by sea in those times in the Indian Ocean. That type of traveling by sea was possible because the Muslims had early on discovered the monsoon system, which allowed them in some particular season to go up north, or in another season to go down south, because the winds were pushing them in the right direction, or to go south at some point, or to come back north later on in the year. And it is this monsoon system, as properly understood by Muslim traders, that was allowing them to control somehow all the sea trade of the Indian Ocean very early on. And a good sign of it is this gold dinar of a Fatimid caliph that was discovered in a shipwreck in the northern part, a little island in the north of of Madagascar. I can circulate it here. That's a gold dinar that was recovered from a shipwreck in Madagascar. And it's a good Fatimid gold dinar. It was a good proof that as early as the beginning of the 11th century, indeed, Muslim traders coming from Fatimid Egypt had been able to go as far south in the Indian Ocean as Madagascar. And so, what kind of traveling by sea did it mean? We know of the type of sailing boats that were used, because Marco Polo used them at some point when he came back by sea from India to the west. And the main characteristic of those sailing boats, apart from the fact that they have lateen sails, is that they were built with the different parts of the hull stitched with each other. There was no nail, as it explained here by Marco Polo. Their ships are wretched affairs, and many of them get lost, for they have no iron fastenings and are only stitched together with twine made from the husk of the Indian nut. The ships are not pitched, but are rubbed with fish oil, which must have smelled like hell. They have one mast, one sail, and one rudder, and no deck. And so those were the type of ships that probably Marco Polo traveled with. Today, of course, you will not find in that region many sail ships left. They are still building some booms, some type of bows, as they are also called. For example, here in the Sultanate of Oman, in the city of Sur, which we visited a few years ago with students of the Hartford Seminary when we went to Oman, and the sails have been replaced by engines. And so those ships you will now find everywhere in the Indian Ocean, as far as Jakarta, Indonesia sometimes, but they are all driven by engines and not by sails anymore. If you want to see still some of those ancient original sailing ships and you want to see them build, then you have to go to a place like Zanzibar. Here in a village in the northern part of Zanzibar, we had the opportunity to go to a shipyard and see how those wonderful ships are made. This time they are using nails, they are not stitching the different planks together. But what is very different from the way ships are built there compared to what they do in the West is that they start by putting all those planks together, and after they have given the shape to the ship, then they will strengthen the structure by adding those ribs, which is exactly the opposite of what is done in the West, where they will start with those ribs and then put on the planks or the pieces of iron around them. But the way those ships are still built in places like Zanzibar or other cities of Eastern Africa is still very traditional. So here you can have a look at the skills of some very simple tools, but excellent skills. He knows exactly the shape he has to give to the rib he's working. Or this one is drilling a hole with a very ancient type of tool. Don't think that they use electricity. No, it's all by their own power that they achieve some of the most beautiful ship buildings that I have been able to witness. And then once the ship is more or less ready to go to sea, another important step is to give it a mast. And in itself, as we saw there, it demands the efforts of a number of people, because those masts are very heavy, one piece of wood, and then, as you see here, they have to lean towards the front of the ship, not towards the rear, which makes it even more difficult. But that one, I asked those who were building it, was going to go down to Mozambique. And indeed, you can still see around Zanzibar, along the coast of Eastern Africa, the most beautiful dhows using the wind to power them and not just engines, as is the case in the Gulf or in other parts of the Indian Oceans. But what was life on board of those sailing ships? What did Ibn Battuta have to go through? Don't think it was a 5-star type of cruise. And we have some way of knowing what it must have looked like, thanks to this Australian sailor called Alan Villiers, who at the end of the period between the two wars in 1939 traveled from the Gulf down the coast of Arabia and then down to Eastern Africa on one of those sailing ships, at the time still powered by sails. He produced wonderful books about these adventures with wonderful photographs giving us an idea of everyday life on board. Here you have the cook, there you have the prayer, here you have the different sailors dealing with the sails, and that's the dhow on which he sailed from Arabia to Eastern Africa. But this can still seem very romantic. If you read his travelogue, you get a better idea of the appalling conditions in which people like Ibn Battuta a few centuries ago must have traveled. That's a dhow also filled with people, and those are passages of the travelogue by Alain Villiers. Exactly how many passengers we had on board at that stage of the voyage I never discovered, though I tried every day to count them. We now had 40 persons on the poop alone, and the daily prayers were a scramble, for there was no room for all to bow and kneel together. All the passengers stretched themselves on the deck, some wrapped in sacking from the cargo, some in indigo and red racks, others with blankets. Some of the merchants, who were a bit more rich, had elaborate beds, which their men spread for them each evening on 6 feet of the poop, beds bright with tasseled rugs and gay cushions. But in the greyness of the mornings, when the muezzin seems to try to see who could make the greatest din, when the bedding and the carpets were wet with dew, and there was no prospect of breakfast other than unleavened bread, when the Bedouin and their half-caste noisily sliced themselves with seawater and the children yelled, I sometimes wonder why I had come. So I think that's a good description of the way Muslim sailors have traveled on overcrowded sailing ships for centuries. And 100 of our passengers were sick, and the ship was a mess. That says it all. But even in the midst of noise and filth and squalor, the stately Bedouins from the desert maintained the little courtesies of their daily life, the greetings, the mannerly respect toward one another, the proper decorum of the tribal eating mats, the ceremonious serving of the dreadful coffee, the constantly cramped quarters, the crowds, the wretched food, the exposure to the elements, the day-long burning sun and the night-long heavy dews, if they continued to be disadvantages, were far offset by the interest of being there, and the voyage never became monotonous. So I think this, which is written in 1939, could have also been a description of the type of traveling by sea that Ibn Battuta went through at the beginning of the 14th century to go down the eastern coast of Africa. And so that's how indeed Ibn Battuta sailed to Kilwa. He tells it himself in his Rahla, in the book that he dictated at the end of his life when he had traveled the whole world, and he describes Kilwa as a large city on the sea coast. The city of Kilwa is one of the finest and most substantially built towns. Its people engage in jihad on the mainland, and they are for the most part religious and upright and Shafi'ite. Kilwa is here, southern Tanzania, a little bit above the border of Mozambique. And why was Kilwa so rich and so important? Because, in fact, it controlled the gold and slave trade of the region. And Kilwa was part of a number of cities that all around the Indian Ocean and as far as Indonesia were somehow trade centers, and all those trade centers were in the hands of Muslim traders. The Indian Ocean, from the 7th, 8th century to the 16th century, was nothing but a Muslim lake. And in Kilwa, the gold was coming from what is today Zimbabwe, at the time Great Zimbabwe, a very interesting African civilization that is unfortunately not given enough importance, but where a lot of gold was produced. The gold would go from Great Zimbabwe to the coast and then come to Kilwa, and then in Kilwa it would be used to buy Chinese pottery, like those sherds that have been found in Kilwa, and the money that was used in Kilwa would go as far as sometimes what is now Australia, as some of the coins produced in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. Sorry, it's a professional habit. But in the time of Ibn Battuta, have been found in 1944 here in the northern part of Australia. So you see enormously wide trade exchange from Africa to East Asia. And so those are the types of coins that were produced in Kilwa at the time of Ibn Battuta. The most important for us is the one in the middle, which is by the Sultan al-Hassan bin Sulaiman. That's the Sultan of Kilwa that Ibn Battuta met when he went there. And those are bronze coins. We would expect the sultans of Kilwa to produce nice gold dinars as well. They knew better. They would probably keep the gold for them and just have bronze coins as their currency. And so this Al-Hassan, son of Suleiman, Sultan of Kilwa, we have a bit of historical information about him from a later Arab source called the History of Kilwa, and also from later Portuguese source. He was called Abul Mawahib, meaning the generous one, the one who gives many gifts. And he was also an eminent scholar who had studied in Aden Islamic science and spirituality, and who also was characterized by generosity and courage. And the generosity of that Sultan of Kilwa must have been known very far away, and that was probably the main reason for which Ibn Battuta went down to Kilwa. Because if you read Ibn Battuta's Rihla, his travelogue, you see that the guy goes where there is money, very often. He hopes indeed that he will be sponsored by the local rulers, preferably in gold. It happened to him a few times. And when he is not interested in just making some money, he is also interested in meeting religious sheikhs or Sufis all around the Muslim world. But I think that his main reason to go to Kilwa was indeed what he had heard and what he was expecting from the generosity of the Sultan al-Hassan bin Sulaiman Abul Mawahib. And so, when he arrives in Kilwa, he indeed describes what happened to him there. He speaks of the generosity of Abul Mawahib and says that people come from all over the Muslim world to visit him, hoping to receive some gifts from him. He gives the names of a few of those Muslim travelers who came to Kilwa, and the Sultan of Kilwa is a man of great humility. He sits with the fuqara, with the faqirs, thank you, meaning generally, faqir in this case means Sufi sheikh. And you know, Sufi, you can be a Sufi, but you still need to make a living. So if you can find a nice sponsor, it will even be better. And so he describes a deed of charity by the Sultan Abul Mawahib, but then we have this little sentence: most of their gifts are of ivory, they rarely give gold. What a disappointment it must have been for that Ibn Battuta. And then later on, after Ibn Battuta left Kilwa, Al-Hassan bin Sulaiman was succeeded by his brother Daoud, who was a mean, stingy guy. So despite the fact that Ibn Battuta didn't make much gold during his visit in Kilwa, it was probably still the best time to go there, better than under the successor of Al-Hassan bin Sulaiman. And so he came to Kilwa by sea. That's what at some point I did as well, with my guide Osman, not Osman, Osmani, because in the language they speak around there, all the words are receive an added E at the end. So it will give me some bread, it will be give me some bready. And so Osman, my guide, very nice chap.
You're welcome. مرحبا بكم في مكان الكيلوا.
شكرا يا سيدي. Spoke fluent Arabic as well. And as Kilwa is an island, we had to approach it by boat. Our little one was powered by an engine, but you could still see some sailing dogs there. And it took us to Kilwa, which is now a UNESCO protected site. And
you're welcome.
And in Kilwa, you have wonderful ruins that we very seldom hear about in Islamic history books or books of Islamic architecture. Among those ruins, you have the palace of Husuni Kubwa, which is probably where Ibn Battuta was received by the Sultan Al-Hassan bin Sulaiman. There is a big square courtyard here where probably the traders were establishing their tents, and this was the palace itself with different courtyards, including a wonderful pool there. It is on the shore, so the ships of the traders coming to the island could directly reach the palace. There was a special stairs going from the private parts of the palace down to the shore, and here you have the courtyard for the commercial exchanges. Of course, this palace is now in ruins, as you say, but we can still have a good idea of what it must have looked like, because it is enormous. And so that's how it has been imagined by some modern archaeologists, and they have found this stone in which Al-Hassan bin Sulaiman describes himself saying that Inna Allah Nasir Amir al-Mu'minin, so he gives himself the title of Commander of the Faithful, Al-Malik al-Mansur, the king helped by God, Al-Hassan bin Sulaiman, Wathaqahu Allah Ta'ala, may God give him support, in a beautiful Arabic calligraphy. So it is a real sultanate that was developed there in Kilwa. And it was not just an enormous palace, it was also a palace that was adorned with very impressive forms of art. mostly in stone. Here you see a piece of a wall that has, or where the stones have been carved. That's the octagonal bathing pool part of the palace. They have found pots of china ware that must have arrived in Kilwa from as far as Indonesia or China for exchange with the products of the Sultanate of Kilwa. And there is also in Kilwa, and that was the monument I wanted to see the most, a wonderful mosque, dating back originally from the 11th century, but that was later on made wider, and in which we can think that indeed Ibn Battuta at some point might have prayed as well. So those are details of the prayer room here, one of the little domes, the facade, and the main entrance to the mosque. And let's listen to my guide, Othmani, telling us about this mosque.
We're in the Great Mosque. The front side of the Great Mosque came constructed around the 11th century by the first Sultan of Kilwa, Hassan bin Ali. And this mosque is one of the very famous mosques in Kilwa. It was the biggest mosque than all sub-Sahara around the 13th to 14th century. And one of the great Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta, got opportunity to come and pray in this mosque. So Ibn Battuta said Kilwa is one of the beautiful cities that he have visited. So Ibn Battuta said the Kilwa Sultan, when he comes out of the mosque of every Friday, he was giving poor people, each one a new piece of cloth as a swadaka for those who waiting for him outside the mosque who are keeping online. Then he gives them a new pieces of cloth. So this is one of the very, very impressive mosques of Kilwa.
Thank you, Hassan Othmani. Okay. And there are a few other mosques all around the ruins of Kilwa. There are tens of little oratories all around the island. The jungle has invaded them, and the archaeologists are spending a lot of energy trying to keep them in some shape where they can be visited, and indeed they are doing a good job, especially with the main one. And so I have the impression that I'm losing, give me a minute, I'm losing some of the slides that should, sorry for that, but where are we? It happens. Okay, yeah, it's that one. The city of Kilwa remained an important center of trade until the end of the 15th century. But you have to realize that starting from the beginning of the 15th century, the Portuguese are very interested in discovering a way of going around Africa to go to India and to the east. And it is amazing to see how year after year during this 15th century, the Portuguese are always going a bit further south, around the western coast of Africa, until at the end of the century, they finally reach the Cape of Good Hope and find the entrance to the Indian Ocean, which had been their dream for more than a century. And once they arrive there, the expansion will be very rapid towards the northern part of the Indian Ocean. They will occupy the island of Socotra, blocking the entrance to the Red Sea. They will build a fortress in Hormuz, blocking the entrance to the Persian Gulf, and somehow putting an end to the very profitable trade that was going on thanks to the Gulf or thanks to the Red Sea in Egypt or in the Middle East with the West. No, it will be far quicker, less expensive, and to have ships coming from Portugal to India, taking all the spices the Europeans want, far more than any of those would be able to carry, or any caravan of camels would be able to carry from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and a few months later being back in Portugal. And so the Portuguese succeeded in a few years in putting an end, a definitive end, to the predominance of the Muslim traders in the Indian Ocean. And they did it in a very violent way. We don't hear often about that type of crusade, because that's how they looked at it as well, that went on once they arrived at the Cape of Good Hope. And the first Portuguese who arrived in Kilwa was someone called Pedro Cabral in 1500. He arrived in Kilwa. 2 years later, Vasco da Gama arrived in Kilwa as well, and forced the local sultan to become a subject of the kings of Portugal, threatening him with destruction of his city if he didn't accept the suzerainty of Portugal. And so Kilwa lost its independence then because of Vasco da Gama. But 3 years later, it was the physical end of Kilwa, because Francisco de Almeida came from Portugal and this time destroyed Kilwa. And it's not just the city of Kilwa that passed then into the hands of the Portuguese, but all the other trade centers on the eastern coast of Africa became Portuguese colonies. And so the Muslims lost their, how would I say that? Lost all their sea roads in the Indian Ocean to the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, when they arrived there, were indeed considering that they were helped in defeating those Moors, those Muslims, as they called them, thanks to the help they were receiving from Santiago Matamoros, St. James the killer of Moors, St. James the killer of Muslims. Here you have in a Portuguese history of the arrival of Francisco de Almeida in Kilwa, it's quite clear. He was the commander of the Order of St. James, and as the following day was the festival of the Apostle, his first care was to solemnize his feast, because not only was it his special duty to do so as knight of his order, but it is also the duty of the whole of Spain, whose patron Santiago is, and because his name in the war, in all battles against the Moors. And so that's what I call the crusading aspect of the Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean. It was both a religious and a commercial enterprise. And in fact, the Portuguese very quickly will be able to go as far as China and even Japan, and they will be in total control of the Indian Ocean, which will become a Portuguese lake for centuries. They will build this fortress in Kilwa, which is a fortress where I arrived in that little boat I took to the island, and which is still there, standing, built in the beginning of the 16th century by D'Almeida. The aim being to control the gold trade that was coming from Zimbabwe and Mozambique, Sofala, reaching Kilwa. And so what Kilwa became in the later centuries, or there were still so-called sultans, but they were vassals to the Portuguese crown. They had no real power. They were still able to practice Islam and build a few mosques, but the trade of gold and slaves was not in their hands anymore, so they had far more financial means. And at the beginning of the 18th century, the Portuguese and the Sultanate of Oman competed with each other for control over Kilwa. And so around 1770, Kilwa became again some kind of independent sultanate before a few years later having to submit to the Sultan of Oman, Majid bin Said, who was also the Sultan of Zanzibar, because he had moved his capital from Muscat in Oman to the island of Zanzibar. So Kilwa became part of the Sultanate of Zanzibar, and then we would expect that it's not the German, it's not the English, that's quite surprising, who occupied Eastern Africa. It is the Germans. It is the Germans who wanted to have some colony. They came a bit late compared to the other European powers, France mostly, the Dutch or the Portuguese or the French, but they invaded Eastern Africa and started producing very interesting coins. There are German coins where on one side you can see the Kaiser, and on the other side you have inscriptions in Arabic. Here you have one in silver, and then you have another one in copper. So the Germans started striking their own coinage in Arabic, here, Sharakat al-Maniya, in Eastern Africa. And those were years where absolutely no freedom was left to the traders of the Muslim traders of the region. It is the Germans who had succeeded somehow to the Portuguese. If you want to read about Kilwa today and to prepare a visit over there, that's probably the best work by Neville Chittick, who has been excavating the ruins of Kilwa for decades. I've just heard that he was assassinated a few years ago in Kenya. But his books, Kilwa, an Islamic trading city on the East African coast, is still probably the best introduction to that city. So Ibn Battuta took us to Kilwa. We really enjoyed visiting what is left of the magnificent buildings that he probably saw in the golden age when he was there, the mosque mostly and the palace. But we also did a few other things as we went to Tanzania, so I will show you quickly where else we went. So we started by going from Dar es Salaam to Kilwa, which is here. Then, of course, being for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa, we had to go to some national park. We went for 2 nights to the Minkumi National Park, which is the closest one to Dar es Salaam. Then we went to Bagamoyo, north of Dar es Salaam, which was the capital of German Eastern Africa. Then we crossed to Zanzibar, where we stayed for 10 days. And Bagamoyo was a very interesting city, because that's where Catholic monks established themselves under the protection of the German colonizers and started buying slaves to give them their freedom. And you have a very interesting little museum about slavery in the convent of those European monks in Bagamoyo. But it's, of course, Zanzibar itself, which is the most amazing place. The island, with its capital, Stone Town, is a vibrant place, mostly Islamic, but there are other religious communities as well. Naturally, it's extremely rich. You have all those spices, vanilla, nutmeg, black pepper, and others that are still produced on the island. The street food is delicious as well. Every evening, little restaurants start producing nice food in the street. The coffee that they sell in the streets, of course, is one of the best I've ever drunk in the world. Just next to the hotel where we were staying, you had the Academy of Music of the Dhow countries, where they were training young musicians in the traditional music of Zanzibar, which is deeply influenced by Arabic music, but is very wonderful as well. And it is, of course, nothing is left of the way for us to imagine how people were living at the time of Ibn Battuta. But still, what we were able to see and experience in Zanzibar was giving us an insight at a very vibrant Muslim community, very peaceful, very serene. And when you see the kids coming from school, coming from a madrasa with an Oxford University rucksack, but holding his girlfriend by the hand like that. When you see them going to prayer in the different mosques of Zanzibar, and you remember that the island of Zanzibar is full of early mosques as well, sometimes as old as the 11th century. They have Islamic graves that are very special, with those kind of obelisks as well in each grave. So it's a world in itself which is worth rediscovering, not just to go on the footsteps of Ibn Battuta, but because Islamic Eastern Africa in itself deserves to be given far better consideration every time we, thank you, Yamin, we speak of Islamic architecture history or just Islamic history. So,
thank you.
You're welcome. And I can make you, if you're interested, I can make you listen to the kind of music which is produced in the Academy of Music of the Dhow countries. If there are questions, I'm of course available.